A workforce realignment. I called it what it was. I had been head of compliance and risk architecture at Meridian Structured Finance for 19 years. Not a glamorous title. Not the kind of job you explain at dinner parties without watching people's eyes drift toward the cheese plate. But it was mine, and I was good at it. And for nearly 2 decades, the company ran cleanly because I made sure it did. I want to be clear about something before I get into what happened. I am not a bitter man. I don't spend evenings rehearsing arguments in my head or fantasizing about people getting their comeuppance. That's not who I am. My wife will tell you I'm almost pathologically even-keeled. She has complained about it, actually, said it can feel like talking to a wall sometimes, the way I process things quietly instead of reacting. I take that as a compliment, even though she doesn't always mean it that way. So when I tell you what happened, I want you to understand it from that place. Not from anger. From clarity. I joined Meridian in 2005. The company was mid-size, regional, doing structured lending and syndication work mostly in commercial real estate and infrastructure finance, not flashy. Solid. The kind of place where people stayed for a long time because the work was serious and the culture didn't rotate its leadership every 18 months chasing trends. I was 34 years old when I started. I had come from a larger firm where I'd spent 6 years building out their regulatory compliance infrastructure after the early 2000s wave of rule changes. I knew the landscape. I understood how structured instruments had to be documented, how counterparty agreements worked, how indemnification language functioned under stress. More importantly, I understood how those things could fail and how you wrote language today that protected the firm tomorrow. My job at Meridian was to own all of that. Contracts, regulatory filings, internal audit protocols, counterparty risk frameworks. I also held the company's primary signatory authority on a category of agreements that the regulators called Type 2 instruments, essentially any structured contract where the underlying collateral carried cross-jurisdictional exposure. That matters later. Over 19 years, I built the compliance function from a 2-person team into a department of 11. We had 0 material regulatory failures in that period. 0. In structured finance, in the regulatory environment of the last 2 decades, that is not a small thing. I never made it into the executive suite. I was not a VP. I was not on the investment committee. I was not invited to the retreats in Scottsdale where the senior leadership played golf and talked about vision. I was the person who made sure the vision didn't land them in front of a federal examiner. I understood my place in the organization, and I was fine with it. I had a good salary, autonomy over my department, and the respect, or at least the functional acknowledgement, of the people who ran the firm. The founder, a man named Whitmore, who had built the company from a regional lending shop, understood what compliance meant. He had lived through enough turbulence to know that the people who kept the lights on were not always the people in the corner offices. Whitmore retired in the spring of 2023. He was 71. He had been talking about stepping back for years, and he finally did it, which was his right, and nobody begrudged him that. What came next is where things got complicated. His son took over. I will call him the son, because honestly that is how most of us thought of him. He had a title, Chief Executive Officer, listed in the new org chart that showed up in everyone's inbox 8 weeks after his father's departure, but within the company he was always just the son. He had worked there for 4 years, in a business development role that was created when he joined, and that produced results I could never fully account for in any financial document I reviewed. He was 31 years old. I have nothing against young executives. I have nothing against family succession. I understand that founders build companies partly so they can hand them to their children, and that is their prerogative. What I do have something against is incompetence dressed up as strategy. Within 6 months of taking over, the son had reorganized the leadership structure 3 times. He had hired 2 consultants from a firm in New York that specialized in what they called organizational efficiency, which, in practice, meant they walked around our offices for 3 weeks, sat in on meetings they didn't understand, and produced a PowerPoint recommending that we eliminate several senior roles and replace them with a centralized management layer reporting directly to him. I watched this process with the patience I mentioned earlier. I answered their questions. I gave them access to documentation they asked for. I explained, when asked, how our regulatory obligations functioned and why certain roles existed. They thanked me and moved on. The PowerPoint was presented to the board in November 2023. I was not in the room. My meeting happened on a Tuesday in February. The son's assistant sent the calendar invite the Friday before. No subject line except discussion. My direct supervisor, I'll call him my supervisor, though by that point the reporting structure had been reorganized enough that the term was loosely defined, told me Friday afternoon that he didn't know what it was about. He said this in a way that suggested he knew exactly what it was about. I spent the weekend the way I usually spend weekends. My wife and I went to see our daughter's school play on Saturday. I fixed a fence post Sunday morning. I read. I slept fine. Tuesday came. I went in, sat across from the son and the head of HR, and listened for about 8 minutes while they explained that my role was being eliminated as part of a workforce realignment designed to position the company for its next phase of growth. They used the word realignment 4 times. The HR director said my contributions had been valued. The son said the company was moving toward a more integrated compliance model and that my function would be absorbed into a new centralized risk and operations team. I asked who would lead that team. He said they were still working through the details. I nodded. I asked if this was effective immediately or if there was a transition period. He said 2 weeks, with standard severance terms per my employment agreement. I thanked them for their time. I stood up. I walked back to my office and I sat down at my desk and I looked at my monitor for a while. Then I opened the folder. There is a document I drafted in the summer of 2009. We were in the middle of the financial crisis and Meridian, like every structured finance operation in the country, was navigating a period of significant regulatory uncertainty. The rules around Type 2 instrument signatories were being revised by the relevant federal oversight body, and the question of what happened to active contracts when a designated signatory departed the firm, voluntarily or otherwise, was genuinely unresolved. I drafted a policy addendum that addressed it, not because anyone asked me to, because I saw the gap and I filled it. The addendum, which was incorporated by reference into the master compliance framework that governed every Type 2I instrument the company originated from that point forward, contained the following provision. In the event that the firm's designated Type 2 signatory departed under circumstances that did not constitute voluntary resignation, meaning, in plain language, termination or role elimination, all active Type 2I instruments for which that signatory held record authority would enter a mandatory review hold, not to exceed 90 days, during which no new draws, transfers, or material modifications could be executed without written co-authorization from both the incoming designated signatory and the relevant counterparty compliance officers. The reasoning was sound, and the regulators agreed with it at the time. You cannot simply swap out the person who holds record authority on a structured instrument without a formal transition process. The counterparties need to know. The regulators need documentation. There are notification requirements and recredentialing steps that take time. I wrote the hold provision to protect the company from executing transactions during that gap that could later be challenged. I had been the firm's sole designated Type 2 signatory since 2009. I counted the active instruments that morning. 61. I did not call an attorney that day. I went home. I told my wife what had happened. She put her hand on my arm and said she was sorry and asked if I was okay. I said I was. She said she knew I was, but asked again anyway because that is who she is. I made dinner. We ate. We watched something on television that I couldn't tell you about now. I went to bed at 10:30. The next morning I called my attorney. I have used the same attorney for personal and professional matters for 12 years. He is meticulous, unhurried, and exactly the kind of person you want when something complicated is about to happen. I explained the situation in detail. I emailed him the addendum, the master compliance framework, and the current instrument register. He called me back 2 hours later. He said, "You drafted this in 2009? I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to make sure I'm reading this correctly. You are currently the sole designated Type 2 signatory for the firm." "Yes." "And your separation was not a voluntary resignation." "Correct. So as of the moment they notified you of your termination, 61 active instruments entered a mandatory review hold." That is how I read it. He was quiet again. I could hear him turning pages. Then he said, "Do you understand what this means for their pipeline?" I said I had some idea. He asked if I was certain the provision had been consistently incorporated by reference in instruments originated after 2009. I told him I had overseen every origination since 2009 and that yes, I was certain. He said, "Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any communications from HR. I'll reach out to their general counsel tomorrow morning. I want to be honest about what I felt in that period. I was not gleeful. I want to be clear about that. Because I think people sometimes hear these stories and imagine the person sitting at home rubbing their hands together, savoring it. That was not what was happening. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Tired of the way it had been handled, tired of 8 minutes and the word realignment. 4 times, and a 31-year-old who hadn't read what he was signing off on. 19 years of making sure the firm didn't step on a landmine, and it had taken less than a year under new management to step directly onto the one I had placed in 2009 to protect them from exactly this kind of careless transition. I also felt, underneath the tiredness, something steadier. Not satisfaction exactly, more like confirmation. The work I had done mattered. It had always mattered. The new management had just proved it in the most direct way possible. My attorney contacted their general counsel on Thursday morning. I did not get a call until Friday afternoon, but my attorney kept me informed of what was happening. Apparently, the general counsel, I'll call him the GC, he was a capable man who had been in the role for about 3 years, had not been aware of the addendum. Not in the sense that he should have been aware of it and had forgotten. In the sense that the onboarding documentation he had been given when he joined the firm had not included the 2009 compliance framework revision in its full form. He had a summary, not the original. My attorney told me that when the GC located the full document and read the provision, he went directly to the son's office and closed the door. He was in there for 45 minutes. The 61 instruments under hold included 14 that were mid-draw on construction phase financing. Those 14 had scheduled draw requests totaling approximately $38 million that were supposed to be processed in the following 3 weeks. They could not be processed, not without my co-authorization and not without notification and sign-off from the counterparty compliance officers at 11 different institutions, some of whom were in different states with their own regulatory requirements for signatory transitions. In addition to the draws, there were 8 instruments in active modification negotiations with counterparties. Those negotiations were effectively paused. The counterparties had their own counsel and their own timelines, and a 90-day hold was not going to sit well with them. There was also the question of the incoming designated signatory. That role had not been filled. The son's plan, to the extent there had been a plan, had been to fold compliance into a centralized operations team. But Type 2 signatory designation requires specific regulatory credentials and a formal registration process with the oversight body. You cannot just appoint someone. It takes months. My attorney explained all of this to their GC, calmly and without any suggestion of leverage. He was simply describing the state of things. Their GC, to his credit, listened. Then he said, "What does your client want?" I want to explain something about that question because it matters. I had thought about it. I had had several days to think about it, sitting in my study in the evenings after dinner while my wife read and the house was quiet. I had thought about what I wanted and what I was owed and what the difference was between those two things. The honest answer was that I wanted an acknowledgement, not in writing, not in a public statement, nothing formal. I just wanted the people who had sat across from me and said workforce realignment to understand, privately in the part of themselves that knew the difference between a decision and a mistake, that they had made a mistake, that the 19 years I had given that place had meant something, and that terminating the person who held the load-bearing structure of the firm's entire regulatory compliance posture in a 40-minute meeting with no real explanation was not a strategy. It was a failure of basic professional judgment. I couldn't ask for that. You can't negotiate for an acknowledgement, so I asked for what I was actually owed. My severance under the employment agreement was 12 weeks. I asked for 24 plus continuation of benefits through the end of the year. I asked for a clean separation agreement with no non-disparagement clause binding me. Only them. I asked for a transition consulting arrangement at my standard day rate, capped at 60 days, to cover the period necessary for them to work through the signatory transition process with the oversight body. I also asked that my 2009 addendum be properly indexed in the firm's compliance documentation going forward, so that whoever came after me would know it existed. That last one wasn't a negotiating point. I just didn't want the whole thing to happen again to someone else. Their GC came back with a counter on the severance. They offered 20 weeks instead of 24 and accepted everything else. My attorney called me with the counter and I said, "Take it." He paused. He said, "You sure? We have significant leverage here." I said I was sure. 20 weeks was fair. I wasn't there to extract the maximum from people who were already in a difficult situation, largely of their own making. I wanted what was right, not everything available. We signed the separation agreement 10 days after the initial termination notice. I worked as a consulting signatory for the following 48 days while their new compliance lead completed the credentialing process. I answered every question thoroughly. I documented everything they would need going forward. I left the department in better shape than the headcount would suggest it should have been. On my last day, I shook hands with the GC, who had been decent throughout. He said he appreciated the professionalism. I told him I hoped the transition went smoothly. I meant it. I did not see the sun on my way out. I heard later through a former colleague who stayed on that he had been put in a substantially reduced role within 6 months. The board had brought in an outside CEO to manage the firm properly after the pipeline freeze had cost them 2 counterparty relationships. I don't know the details, and I didn't ask for them. My wife and I took 2 weeks and went somewhere we had been meaning to go for years. The Pacific Northwest. We drove the coast, stayed in small places, ate well, went to sleep when we were tired. I started a consulting practice that fall. It turns out there is a significant market for someone who spent 19 years building compliance infrastructure at a mid-sized structured finance firm and knows where the gaps tend to live. I work about 30 hours a week. I choose my clients. The work is interesting. A few months ago, I was sitting in a coffee shop waiting for a meeting with a prospective client, and I found myself thinking about that Tuesday in February. The 8 minutes. The word realignment. The son's face when he said they were still working through the details. I thought about the folder I had opened when I got back to my desk, the document dated July 14, 2009, drafted because I had seen a gap and filled it, the way I had always done, the way no one in that building had ever fully understood was the point of the work. There's a version of this story where I'm angry, where I talk about the years I gave and what they were worth and the injustice of how it ended. That's not the story I have. The story I have is that I did the work correctly for 19 years, including a summer afternoon in 2009 when I wrote a paragraph that nobody read for 14 years. And when it mattered, the paragraph was there. I call that good engineering. People sometimes ask me if I regret not pushing harder. 24 weeks instead of 20. The full leverage, fully applied. I understand why they ask. On paper, the position I held in those negotiations was significant. 61 instruments, $38 million sitting frozen, 11 counterparty institutions waiting on a process that couldn't move without me. I could have asked for more and probably gotten it. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. What you do when you have power over someone says more about you than what you did to earn that power in the first place. I spent 19 years at that firm doing the work correctly because it was the right way to do it, not because I was building toward a moment, not because I was keeping score. I wrote that addendum in 2009 on a summer afternoon because I saw a gap that could hurt the company and I filled it. That's all. I wasn't thinking about what would happen if they ever used it against me. I wasn't thinking about myself at all. I was thinking about the work. And that, I think, is the thing worth sitting with. The son made a decision based on a surface-level read of an organizational chart. He saw a title, assessed a cost, and moved. What he didn't do, what he hadn't built the patience or the experience yet to do, was understand what the role actually held. There's a version of that story where I'm the victim of it. But I don't think that's the right frame, because the same qualities that made me valuable enough to be a threat to his realignment plan were the qualities that protected me when the plan landed. The thoroughness, the documentation, the habit of writing things down precisely and keeping them properly indexed. You don't build that kind of rigor in a crisis. You build it in the ordinary days, the Tuesday afternoons when nobody's watching and the work doesn't feel urgent, and it would be very easy to do it well enough instead of correctly. I built it across 19 years of ordinary days. That's not discipline as a strategy. That's just who I decided to be early on and then kept deciding to be. The GC was decent throughout. He understood what had happened and he handled it with professionalism. I respected that. He had been given incomplete documentation when he joined, and he worked with what he had. And when the full picture emerged, he dealt with it squarely. That matters. The institution made a bad decision, but there were still people inside it trying to do the right thing. and I wasn't going to punish them beyond what was fair just because I had the leverage to do so. Whitmore built that company over decades with exactly that kind of integrity. I don't know if his son will find his way to it. That's not my concern anymore. What I know is this: the work was real. The 19 years were real. The paragraph I wrote on a summer afternoon in 2009 was real, and it was there when it needed to be, because I had done it right the first time. That's the whole story. That's enough.